Alright, YouTube, several people have asked me to weigh in on Jade Helm. Now, I've discussed this to some detail to other people. There's a link in the description to the Jade Helm map that was essentially sent out. I put some labels on it, although I haven't rotated it. But rotating it is actually important because if you look at this map, and you look at a couple of the strange phenomena on it, you will clearly see what it is actually for. It has nothing to do with a U.S. martial law scenario. I've already discussed why martial law is not going to be imposed on the U.S. population for malevolent means, specifically while people actually have weapons. I just don't think that it would go over well. I think ultimately it would fail, but that's just my thought on it. You know, rounding up over 300 million people would be a little difficult without the cooperation of state guardsmen, state troops, a lot of local police forces and sheriffs that probably would not comply, let's face it, including military units that would defect. So I don't really worry about a martial law scenario nationwide. Just not on my priority list to worry about. I know some people probably call me a shill for that, but I can explain what I think that I'm seeing with this map, because it's uncannily similar to another region of the world. In fact, even the weather and geography is relatively similar. The Middle East. Look at the little red strip in Southern California. What does that look like? Looks like the Gaza Strip. Roughly the same size, too. That's not a coincidence. This is a map of the Middle East rotated 45 degrees, folks. What this is, what Jade Helm appears to be, is a training exercise, because our troops can't train the Middle East right now. It's too fucking hostile. They can't take part in any sort of training simulations in the actual Middle East. It's just not possible at this juncture. There's too much instability. There's ISIS, there's Al-Qaeda, there are Shiite rebels in Yemen, there are Shiites everywhere running around destroying things. ISIS is destroying mosques, they're destroying ancient ruins, they're destroying fucking everything in their path. The Israeli-Palestinian situation is unstable at the moment, even though there look to be signs from the UN that maybe finally there will be a two-state solution that's actually viable long-term. I think that this is a larger training exercise should the Middle East implode and should one of several things happen. The rise of someone in a formerly allied state that is more loyal to or more friendly with the Chinese or Russians, the ousting of somebody that's friendly, a state that's friendly, their government or military or whatever there, by ISIS or a similar group, general upheaval, the collapse of economies in some of these regions, and I'll tell you exactly what this map looks like to me. Texas is Iran. Now, I hate to tell that to all the Texans, but for the purposes of these training exercises, you're Iran, sadly enough. Southern California, that little strip, is the Gaza Strip. Utah is Syria. Colorado is Turkey. Nevada is Jordan. California is, fittingly, Israel, California. Arizona is Egypt, and New Mexico is Iraq. That's what you're looking at here. I think Lebanon's not really on here, maybe because it's, basically a non-state actor at this point that's just run by fucking Shiite militants. I don't know exactly why that's missing. But if you look at this, it makes sense. Iran is a relatively large nation that in a regional war may be, hostile towards U.S. forces. Syria in Utah, that makes some level of sense. Even I believe roughly a similar size as well. You gotta realize these states are huge. The Gaza Strip being Southern California, might make sense, I guess. It's the same size and shape, so yeah, it does. Gaza connects to Egypt. What does this little red strip connect to? Arizona. Perfectly sums up Egypt. Similar, again, desert basically, and relatively flat for a large proportion of the state. But you've got to remember, Egypt is leaning permissive towards the United States. The administration that's in Egypt right now tends to be relatively friendly towards the Western world and more or less ambivalent towards some of these other powers. They're tied with Turkey, which is represented as a state that's on our side, which makes sense. Turkey's in NATO. And is somewhat hostile towards, the Iraqi regimes that have been stirring up trouble, specifically ISIS. Egypt is really no friend to them. With Iraq being New Mexico, they don't have it marked as hostile. They have it marked as leaning hostile. Why? Most of Iraq is controlled by Shiite groups that aren't really friendly anymore to the United States, specifically because they realize that our own maneuvers, our own funding of some of these sort of puppet militants in Syria really kicked off most of their problems. ISIS, while it wasn't created in a strict sense by the United States, has gleaned quite a lot of support by taking weapons that we left in the region under relatively low security thresholds. They've gobbled up those goods. They now have what amounts to a fairly large and fairly sophisticated military force, although they don't have the training to actually use many of those weapons, thankfully, which is why you haven't seen more bloodbath than you have. And Iraq, in any regional war, would be leaning hostile towards the United States because neither the Shiites there nor the militants are necessarily very friendly towards us. But at the same time, there's a chance that open hostility towards one side or the other could be delayed or deferred in some way, I guess. So this is a map of the Middle East. Just rotate it 45 degrees and then look at a map of the Middle East. And what are you looking at? You're looking at a similar scenario with a similar climate overall, generally speaking. You're looking at a similar land area to at least a large part of the Middle East. And you're looking at similar geography in many cases, very dry and arid, a lot of flat land, sort of steppe and desert, a lot of, high, dry mountain ranges, basically the same as the Middle East. The fact that California is in a drought makes it even more perfect because it makes it even more like a part of the Middle East, let's face it, at this point. I do not believe it has anything to do with martial law, and to those people who have noted the movement of large numbers, admittedly, of tanks and APCs and other military goods and even like razor wire on trucks and stuff around this general area and perhaps elsewhere as well, I would say my prediction has been for some time now that a regional war in the Middle East, if it does erupt, is going to lead to a much wider war. If not a World War III scenario, at the very least, worldwide destabilization and a hell of a lot of infighting. I'm not too surprised that they're moving military goods to what could be considered fairly remote locations in the rural Southwest. I'm not surprised. I think, honestly, the government has reopened Cheyenne Mountain, which is an EMP-proof, vast underground, under-mountain fortress that could withstand a direct hit by the Tsar Bomba. Why do you think that they reopened it? You think they reopened it because, oh, well, there's the vague possibility that we might go to war with some nation. No, they're worried about a nuclear war. They wouldn't have a reason to staff and reopen and renovate and spend anything on Cheyenne Mountain if they didn't think there was at least a remote possibility that they would need it for their systems. Of course they're worried about such a happening. And I've discussed exactly why in both After the Ashes and here on YouTube. I've told people exactly why they're worried. We are coming to a head over resources and demographic crises worldwide now. There are only so many resources. Green energy is great. Technological advances are great. Science is wonderful. It can't account for all of the growth and all of the subsequent resources that are needed because of that growth to feed the population. These governments are worried that they will destabilize and collapse. Now, the United States government, if I had to take a reading of what they were thinking about, they're not worried about their own demographics collapsing. The United States is relatively thinly populated compared to some of these other countries. They're not worried about the population here suddenly collapsing. They're not necessarily worried about instability here. I see bright things potentially in the future for the American economy. I know everyone else is doom and gloom, and I think we could have some market correction or a currency decline or something, but altogether, ultimately, I see bright things in the United States' future. Why then would we have this staging exercise? Clearly, the level of instability I would be predicting from any of the things that might happen here doesn't rise to the level that would necessitate this type of vast troop movement. It's a training for the Middle East. They're training specifically because in the past, a decade ago, we could train right in the Middle East. We had secured these locations. Our troops were already there. Might as well train them while they're over there because they're not going anywhere. They're occupying, most of Iraq. Well, there's nothing else really that you can do. Same with Afghanistan. All these troops are in there. Afghanistan, by the way, is actually relatively stable when you think about it, which is actually almost miraculous considering what a shithole Iraq has turned into. We actually appear to have won in Afghanistan tentatively, which surprised me, I always thought it'd be more unstable than Iraq would be in the future, but I guess I was wrong. Anyways, this is a training exercise for a regional war in the Middle East that involves all the states there. You know why they're doing this? What have the Saudis and Egyptians and Pakistanis primarily, but other nations as well, what have they done? They've formed a de facto military alliance. What has Iran done? Along with Syria, the Shiites in Iraq, the Shiites in Yemen, the Lebanese, and Shiites elsewhere. It's formed a de facto military alliance. You've got the Shia and the Sunni, not necessarily solidified into sort of a pan-Persian diaspora versus a pan-Saudi diaspora or a pan-Sunni alliance. Not completely solidified, but more or less, they've got two de facto alliances that really, for a very long time, have struggled against one another for leverage in this region. I pointed this out. The reason why this particular region is so volatile is you have an area of completely destabilized land, Syria and Lebanon to a lesser extent. I mean, it's overrun with militants. Iraq, down into parts of northern Saudi Arabia and Jordan are coming under attack. Parts of southern Turkey are at threat, specifically over damming the Euphrates, parts of the border with Iran. You've got this rather large area of land in which all of the borders are artificial. None of them are historical borders. They're provincial borders that were carved out by colonial powers. They're non-states. They're not based on ethnicity. They're not based on tribal affiliation. They're not even based on religion. They're a compilation of different tribes and sub-religious groups within Islam, the Alawites, certain Christian groups, Jews, things like that. And it's surrounded by powers. It's surrounded by Iran on one side, which is a regional power, Turkey in the north, which is a regional power and part of NATO, Saudi Arabia in the south, which is a regional power and also an energy powerhouse, and Egypt, which is also a regional power and controls the Suez Canal. You've got four relatively powerful, relatively developed states with much larger economies and much larger military forces and much more sophisticated military forces, surrounding an area full of militants with failed governments all around that could potentially implode and spill over the borders of any of these states. What happens if that happens? If the fighting spills over into Iran, the Iranians will respond. They will bulldoze their way through Mesopotamia. What do you think Turkey and Egypt are going to do if that happens? Turkey doesn't want to deal with Iran suddenly having control of this region. Some of them are former Ottoman areas anyway. I'm sure that Erdogan would love to take back control of Turkey and Lebanon. He'd love to do that. The Iranians would love to control Iraq. The Egyptians would love to get involved and actually glean some of this land. The Saudis would love to push north through Iraq. They all would love some of this land and some of these resources. They're holding back right now because they're terrified of what might happen, specifically because of the wedge between the Shia, in Iran especially, and the Sunnis elsewhere in this region. Turkey is also growing into a style of pseudo-nationalism. The Saudi Arabians are losing their stance as the main power within the region on the low oil prices. Egypt is right now rising back up kind of to where it was on trade in some of their agricultural goods from the Nile Delta. Iran, potentially with this deal, could gain power. What Uncle Sam is trying to do with this Iranian deal is stave off a regional war. If it fails, I predict there will be a regional war. Millions and millions will die. Russia may get involved. China may get involved. You could already see them get involved with a war in the West over, respectively, Ukraine and the South China Sea anyway. The Middle East would just throw a totally new dimension into it, and things would probably spiral out of control. And let's not kid ourselves. This is not far away from Europe either. Cyprus and Greece and Turkey, which is a member of NATO, they're not far away from the area that ISIS controls. Turkey is separated from ISIS by a few miles of border in some of these regions controlled by Kurdish groups and by other militant forces that oppose ISIS. The area has been thrown into uproar. When I see the map of Jade Helm, I see the Middle East. And what gives it away, and it took only a few seconds to realize this, when you see the little strip of land in Southern California that's being marked as insurgent pocket, that's the Gaza Strip. It's the Gaza Strip. Like it or not, for the purposes of this specific style of exercise, the government's assuming that the Gaza Strip, I guess, will implode and that, militants will pour in there. ISIS will make a landing there and start attacking Israel or something. I think that may be less likely, but that's just for the purposes of this specific sort of simulation exercise. Jade Helm is an exercise for the runner-up regional war that could lead to World War III. So yes, you should be concerned, but you shouldn't be concerned because, oh, Uncle Sam's going to declare martial law, and Texas says, well, the state guard's going to be watching these activities closely. That's fine. But take a leaf out of those books because, if that area does implode and there is like a World War III, your state National Guard's going to get decimated by nuclear weapons, probably from Russia and China. So you may need to train them to duck and cover. I would be much more concerned about that. Am I concerned about my own government? Absolutely. Look at what the FBI is doing with their spy planes and what the NSA is doing with their Patriot Act that hasn't died, by the way. The USA Freedom Act is a bunch of bullshit. Rand already pointed out why, and people appear to be ignoring him for some reason. They think it's all hunky-dory because a new act passed, and a few of the provisions of the Patriot Act expired. Well, those weren't the provisions, those are kind of worrying, but they weren't the provisions that were really in question. It was really about blanket surveillance that now can continue to go on to an unlimited basis. Nobody appears to want to talk about this other than a few so-called fruitcake sites. So yeah, I'm worried about that, but I'm not worried about martial law. I'm really more worried about the Middle East imploding. I'm really more worried about millions of people getting cut down very quickly there, leading to us having no choice but to get involved. Do you think, if this area destabilizes, I mean fully destabilizes, I'm not talking about, well, militants are purging Iraq. I'm not talking about militants might usurp the government of Syria and set up a Caliph Mesopotamia. I'm talking, what if they start attacking the Turks? What if they start attacking Iran and Iran gets drawn into a war? What if they start lobbing missiles into Saudi Arabia or Egypt? What if Israel gets involved? Yeah, the United States will end up going over there. The problem is, the Iranians will simply advance and start annexing land as they go, because who the fuck's going to stop them? They might end up fighting. What happens if they attack the Turks? What happens if the Turks stand their ground in Syria and say, nope, you're not going any further, we've got this area under our control? And the Iranians push ahead anyway. You'll have a massive, massive war involving a NATO member that claims it was attacked and is acting defensively. Well, NATO's involved. Goody goody, NATO goes into the Middle East, and we won't have a choice. We'll be contractually obligated to do it. And we won't have a choice. What are we going to do, abandon an ally because they get attacked by the Iranians? No, but the problem is the Russians back the Iranians, so there's your problem. Why the fuck do you think they're doing this? Also, look at the name Jade Helm. Jade has a Chinese connotation. They're probably also worried that this destabilized region will end up siding with the Chinese as opposed to traditionally areas in this part of the world. They align themselves tacitly, not necessarily fully, but tacitly, with the United States that really wants their oil, or with Russia that really wants to sell them good weapon systems. What if they decide, well, they're all acting like assholes, we're going to be partnered with the Chinese, and all of a sudden Mesopotamia becomes basically a Chinese colony like they're doing to parts of Eastern Africa? You think the United States wants that to happen? They'll go in and blister the area with flamethrowers and kill everything in their path before they'll let the Chinese have a chunk of the Middle East to exploit. It's just even the Russians wouldn't like that very much. I'm sure that Putin may put on a stern face and pretend to be the best friend that the Chinese ever had. I think he's worried about Chinese expansionism because he realizes that they're completely outmaneuvering Russia and sort of taking over as the second power. I don't think that Putin really wants to play second fiddle to the Chinese. I like to think of him as sort of a nationalistic-minded imperialist in many ways that really kind of hates the Chinese at this point, but realizes he's got no other option but to work with them. But I don't think he'd go so far as to say, oh yeah, it's great that the Chinese took over Iraq and Syria because they've got the manpower required to actually keep the area free of militants. I don't fucking think so. Some people might believe that, I choose not to. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Jade Helm, regional training exercise for a possible Middle Eastern regional war, which should worry you, by the way, just about as much as the idea of martial law should. Because it could get very ugly very quick when you're talking about, the area that supplies about half the world's fuel supply. Yeah, things could get a little bit dicey. Oh, and then there's the matter of the Bosphorus and the Suez Canal, and all of these shipping routes that are at least as important as the South China Sea. Why do you think that the United States turned the other way and looked away when the Saudi Arabians were bombing largely civilian centers in Yemen? Why do you think that we looked the other way? Why do you think that the rest of the West looked the other way? They didn't want to know that there were war crimes going on because they had no other option, because it would have endangered international fuel shipping. So yes, that's what I believe this map represents and what Jade Helm is really about. Yeah, they're training to staff prisons and stave off riots by people who are screaming about food and water. Well, what do you think is going to happen in the Middle East if all the governments there are suddenly endangered and everyone's bombing each other in Mesopotamia? There's going to be a lot of people in that region that will be without food or water. Tens of millions of them, in fact. That's what they're training for. And this is part of a larger training exercise, I'm sure, that would involve NATO troops at that point. Because the United States, for all of our technology and manpower, we would not be able to staff it ourselves. We would have to have the help of our allies. If they weren't willing to give it, we probably couldn't even do it on our own. The logistics of such a scenario would be nightmarish. We'd need at least the support of the local, sort of regional governments, Turkey and Egypt especially, in order to make it work. With this sort of Sunni alliance, this de facto alliance, it could happen. So yeah, that's what I think about Jade Helm. That's about all. Peace out.